Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulihil Kareem. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome back to what is now the third part of our course on Prophetic Economics, an introduction to Islamic finance. This week is actually my favorite week, and it tends to be the week that, or it tends to be the topic that I find brings out the liveliest audience, because it's the subject of money itself. Which sounds like a bit of a sort of philosophical statement. Maybe it sounds a bit boring, but actually I think it's the most interesting of all the subjects that we've covered. So just a quick recap. We've talked about prophetic economics. What is prophetic economics? We talked about riba. What is riba? We've talked about the state of Islamic finance today. We've talked about halal savings and investment options. What is there in the real world? And by the way, all of these are uploaded now to YouTube, so thanks to Altaf and Rehan for doing that. We will try and get these uploaded a little bit more quickly in future weeks, this week and next week. Sorry, next week, by the way, we're not having part 4. There is a week's break, so we're coming back in 2 weeks' time. I'll remind you at the end. So, as I say, parts 1 and 2, we talked about some of the practicalities. And then this week, we're going to talk about money itself. Did they give us? Yeah, they did. That's great. Yeah, you guys can see that. Good. Right. Do you guys recognize these photos here? Does anyone recognize these photos? Sana knows the answer.
Just the one in the middle.
What is the one in the middle?
That win like a photograph of the year in the Times or something like that.
Yeah, do you know what it's about?
Not really. Starving children,
It's South Sudan, 1993. It's a child on the way to a UN camp. And there's a famous photographer called Kevin Carter who took this picture. And journalists and photographers were told, you're not allowed to interfere, like it's a wildlife program. Right? There's a child dying. You can see the vulture in the background waiting. Alhamdulillah, this child made it, by the way. But they were told not to interfere, like you're interfering in the ecosystem, which is insane. Yeah. And he took this photo and he committed suicide shortly afterwards because he couldn't take a world in which human beings treated each other like this. And there's a reason why I posted these pictures. What's the one on the right? You must recognize it. The left.
Is 1930s in the US.
It is, yeah. It's the Depression. So this lady is 32 years old. She looks about 10 or 20 years older. She has 7 children and she's on the way to do, I think it's pea picking. So she stopped by the side of the road on the way to find work, which was very normal at that time. People were, itinerant and they were traveling to find any kind of, any kind of manual labor that they could get their hands on. A photographer caught sight of her and took a picture. It became probably one of the most defining photos of the Depression era. And the one on the right, come on guys, you must, yeah, it is, yeah. So here's a building in which 72 people lost their lives because the contractor could not be bothered to spend £1 or £2 on each piece of cladding. For the sake of that budget, 72 people lost their lives. They all have something in common. What do you think that something in common is?
Transfer of wealth.
Say again?
Transfer of wealth.
Yes. Transfer of wealth. Money.
Not prioritizing the wealth for greater good.
Yeah. And the inequality that we get and that results in these things is a function of the money that we use. So we tend to think of money as just, it's just something we keep in our pockets or our bank accounts. And, it's something we accumulate as wealth. What do you think the economist definitions or a normal definition of money would be? What is the purpose of money?
I think it's around the medium of exchange.
Yeah, medium of exchange.
Unit of account.
Unit of account, that's a good one. There's one more. Store of value, yes. So there's 3 things that they say. Number 1 is that you use it to buy and sell things. Remember we talked about Ghazali a couple of weeks ago? That dirhams and dinars were created to act to pay for goods and services between people. So that's the medium of exchange. It's used to value it's used to measure the value of other goods and services. It doesn't have value by itself. And the second thing was a store of wealth. You can keep it and use it as wealth, and it carries forward that wealth into the future. And the third thing was unit of account, which is quite a sophisticated understanding of what money is, because it means you use a dollar or a dirham or a Bitcoin as a unit of measuring value in other things, which is quite a sophisticated argument, which we'll come to a little bit later. So, how does money originate? Where does it come from? Any ideas?
I mean, initially you would have, you dig out gold from the ground, and that would sort of be the basis of what the value of money was. But nowadays, you said multiple times, ex nihilo, it's from nothing.
Yeah.
It's sort of decreed by the government.
Okay, so that's how money comes into being. How do you think early societies invented money?
Was it bartering, for instance? I had a cow and then I'd exchange excellence for something else. The value takes from this quite.
Okay, any other ideas? So most economists will say barter is where it originated. I don't actually agree. I don't think it makes any sense. Because in order to barter goods and services, if you think about it, you have to have an equivalent and opposite needs and wants in a community. So if you have a small community and you're a carpenter and somebody else is a plumber and your plumbing breaks down, you have to hope that he needs some carpentry services from you simultaneously. So how does one barter those services with each other? So I don't think barter is really a logical way of explaining where money comes from.
Isn't that not the reason why we have money? Because of the
Right.
limitations of it?
But how do you think early societies would have agreed to exchange goods and services without bartering? Because you'd have to have simultaneous needs and wants.
I did you a favor, so in the future, can you...
That's brilliant. Yeah. Okay. Favor. I did you a favor. So what is a favor? It's a debt, right? So I owe you something. So now you have communities, small communities, where you circulate, maybe it's an IOU, a piece of paper that says, okay, you did something for me, I owe you a service that's equivalent to that. And over time you start to work out against some particular unit of measurement. It could be seashells. It could be sticks in which you put little notches. It could be some other form of money that you use. This is money that is used to measure the value of other goods and services. So now you've created debt in society. You've created, and this is not a, there's nothing wrong with that. It's, debt is useful. It's useful to create a system of measuring what we owe each other. We might operate on a trust system where we say, you did me a favor one day and tomorrow I'll do you a favor, you know, the next time you need it. But that's not a very accurate way of measuring it. So now we've created these pieces of paper, we're circulating them in the community and saying, oh, you know, this farmer owes me this much or this plumber owes me this much. And now we've put a unit of account against that measurement of the IOU. So this is how money originates, according to anthropologists, but not necessarily according to economists. And I tend to subscribe to that view that you do each other favors and you measure how you do each other favors. It originates as debt. There's a really great book, and I think I mentioned it earlier, called Debt, the First 5,000 Years by David Graeber, who was an anthropologist and economist. And it essentially charts the history of how money was invented. Right, so I asked this question not necessarily of orthodox economists, but of heterodox economists, of anthropologists, of philosophers, of theologians, maybe even physicists, and we'll come on to why physicists, because I think there is the laws of thermodynamics, I think, are also important to understanding how money works, and we'll come on to that in a short while. So, to recap, a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value. It's used to measure, it should be used to measure the value of goods and services in the real economy. Do you remember this difference between the real economy and the financial economy? Anyone want to take a stab at what the difference is?
The real economy is where you're trading, buying goods, services, etc.
Yeah.
Your local barber, your local restaurant.
Yeah.
The financial economy is the stock market.
Yeah.
And
it's pieces of paper
values,
shuffling around related to whatever the real economy is doing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Correct. Yeah, exactly. So I like this idea that money originates as debt. And what happened in early society is that once a community becomes large enough to conquer a rival tribe or a neighboring community, it's able to capture them and enslave them. So human beings become slaves as a result of war. What happens when debt enters the equation is that, in early societies, you have these, what I might term industrial concerns, but we might call temples. And in these temples you store grain and other commodities. And the priests who run these temples are really a type of merchant. And they lend out their commodities so that merchants can go and trade those, and they pay the temples a rate of interest, because it's very hard to measure what profits and losses people are making. You might get defrauded. So instead they say, just pay us a fixed rate of return and bring the grains back. What happens if you can't repay the commodities that you borrowed? What happens next? It's not different from what happens today.
Is it an asset, for instance? In this context, you're talking about someone's got a slave.
Yeah.
I'll give you my slave.
Collateral.
Yeah,
Collateral.
Yeah.
So the priests lending out their commodities say, you have to pay me back the principal plus interest. And if you can't, what's your collateral? What do you own that I can possess? And if they have nothing to own or possess, what do? They offer themselves or their families as collateral. So you become, if you fail to repay, a debt slave, a peon, a debt peon. And debt slavery was prevalent. So now, slaves are not just a result of war. Slaves are a result of ordinary, everyday merchant activities. Society is full of masters and slaves. So, so we're saying in ancient societies, debt leads to slavery. And violent coercion is obviously the primary enforcement mechanism to ensure that debt is passed down from generation to generation. So if your father was a slave, then you become a slave and your children become slaves. What happens when there's too many slaves in society? What would happen if 90% of the people in society were slaves and only 10% were masters? What do you think would happen next? There would be a revolution. They would overthrow their masters. So there was a neat solution to this. It's called the Law of Jubilee. In fact, I think it's documented, the Bible documents in the 5th century BC, the governor of Judea instituted the Law of Jubilee, which says every Sabbath year, every 7th year, the slate is wiped clean. So all the debt slaves are returned to their families. And that prevents a revolution from taking place. The people don't rise up and overthrow the rulers. So it's a smart way of ensuring every 7 years society resets itself. So what do you think religion does? It says, well, religion outlaws interest. Islam is not alone in that. As I said previously, the church banned usury for the sake of fairness and equality. I think I mentioned there's the only passage in the Bible is mentions Jesus alayhi salam was overthrew the tables of the money lenders in the temple of Herod. And he takes a whip out and he whips them out of there. Because the money lenders, the money changers, were the ones who debased the currency. Do you remember we talked earlier about inflation and debasement of currency and how gold is difficult to debase? But at that time, pilgrims to the temple of Herod used a silver coin, and the money changers were exchanging them for inferior silver coins with maybe a lesser proportion of silver within the coins. So of course this debasement is a form of theft. And then there's a famous passage in the Bible where Jesus turns over the tables of the money lenders and throws them out. So we can see that many religions outlawed interest. Debt itself is not outlawed. It's a perfectly valid transaction for one person to owe another person something. But to make money out of money was considered inherently unjust and led to these problems in society like a large group of slaves. I remind you that Ghazali said, it becomes easier for the financier to earn more money on the basis of interest without bothering himself to take pains in real economic activities. The interests of humanity cannot be safeguarded without real trade, skills, industry, and construction. Allah created dirhams and dinars so that they may be circulated between hands, and act as a fair judge between different commodities and work as a medium to acquire other things. So, do you remember how we define riba? What is riba? Just remind me. Excess, surplus. So, in theory, 1 penny on £1 million is still riba. And I do hear this argument, and we discussed this last time, I do hear this argument from a lot of people who haven't studied fiqh al-mu'amalat, who say, surely riba can only be riba if it's more than the inflation rate. But that's a little bit like saying, surely alcohol is only haram if I have more than a drop. But we know that 1 drop is haram. So the consensus position is that all excess on a principal amount, any excess, is considered riba. As you know, I was moaning last time about how come I never hear a khutbah on a Friday talking about riba. I really genuinely can't remember. I don't know if anyone here has, and somebody mentioned that they'd heard one in Pakistan once. But really, it's one of the most heinous sins in our faith. I think we all recognize that. We know what it is. And yet somehow we've normalized it so much in society, and we're tainted by it everywhere, that we don't even want to talk about it. We don't even want to mention it on Friday. And I find that very odd that we're kind of avoiding this subject, because for me, it's the root of all evil. They say money is the root of all evil. I don't think it's money that's the problem. I think it's making money out of money that's the problem, without, as Ghazali said, taking real risk in trade and services. Yeah, so interestingly, some years back, I think it was in 2014, the House of Commons debated money creation. And it's very instructive to know what our politicians think about money. A poll was done of all members of parliament at the time, and it turned out that 71% of all MPs believe only government has the power to create money. Who has the power to create money?
Thanks.
Banks have the power to create money. How much of money circulating in this economy is created by private sector banks? 97% is the number, yeah. So most of the money circulating in the economy has been created by riba. The pound, the dollar, the yen, the euro, all of these so-called fiat currencies, remember fiat means by decree, so the government decrees it to be money. All of these forms of money are essentially created through riba. All money is riba money, which is a bit weird because we all use it, so we're all tainted by it. And we don't even stop to think about this £10 note in my pocket. Where does it come from? How is it created? Is it a good form of money? Is it a bad form of money? We never really stop to think about these things. So I don't think that politicians really have a clue what they're talking about. They're economically illiterate. I mean, we happen to have one of the worst cohorts of politicians, certainly in my living memory. But you know, the fact that they don't even recognize where money comes from, how it's created, and they're debating it in the Houses of Parliament suggests to me we're just led by the wrong people. Something fundamental has to change. Right. Obviously, you know what this structure is, but the structure that actually matters to us, we can't see it very well. I can't see it from here even. It's a tiny black dot in the middle over there. And this monstrosity that you see around it is called Abraj al-Bayt. And I'm afraid I have a confession to make because I have a part to play in the buildings that were built around that, which I'll come to in a minute. I wanted to talk about high time preference and low time preference. Can we remember what those terms mean, low and high time preference? Anyone?
Low time preference is generally you thinking about the present and discounting less on the future.
Yeah.
And high time preference is essentially the opposite of that.
So it's the other way around. So high time preference is wanting to buy and spend today.
Yeah.
There's no deferred gratification in high time. In low time preference, we're disciplined and we think about the future. Our preference for time is low. So we think long term. When we have high time preference, We're seeking pleasure today. And we live in a society, we live in a world which is high time preference. And I don't think that's by accident. I think that's by design. I think the monetary system that we use contributes to this psychological nudge towards borrow, spending, consuming today. We all want to consume today. We are nudged down this path of materialism. We don't mend things anymore. We just throw them away and replace them with new things. I know my dad's generation, he could fix anything. Whatever went wrong in the house, a washing machine or a microwave or a radio, he would try and fix it before anything else. That doesn't happen with my generation or the generation that comes after me. We look to replace things immediately. There's a reason why that happens. It's because as a society we have high time preference, and we have high time preference because our monetary system has nudged us in that direction, which I hope I'll come to explain in a moment. So my contention is that our economic syllabus. So anyone studying economics here at university? Yeah, we've got a few hands. Anybody else? Yeah, okay. So I would say that, and so before I say anything else, there's a value to studying that degree. But I'm not a fan of economists for reasons that I'm going to explain. And I'm not a fan of what's actually taught in economics degrees. So my contention is that empirical and statistical analysis of economic history has essentially been wiped out of the economic syllabus. Reality is really not part of that syllabus. And modern economics has constructed false models. It's what I call pre-speaking Latin. So they have obfuscated the truth by dressing it up in jargon that the lay people can't understand. So we look to them, the Bank of England economist or Goldman Sachs economist, to give us commentary of what's happening in the world. And we've just we've stopped thinking for ourselves. We've said, these guys are the experts, so let them do their expert thing, without stopping to think from first principles. What exactly is modern economics? What is it trying to do? What is it trying to tell us? What direction is it trying to nudge us towards? And I would say it's only been the last 100 years that we've had this revolution in this body of knowledge that we call economics that has nudged us into a particular type of ideology rather than something scientific and impartial. So what I find is there's a lot of lobbying and funding by large corporations of MBA schools and economics faculties, and it kind of leads to a selective amnesia by the establishment, if you want to call it that, of large swathes of economic history being ignored. So the result is you have a dogma, an ideology. We're not actually being fed a mathematical model. We're being told, you need to behave like this. This is how a good citizen behaves. You keep the economy ticking by throwing stuff away and buying new stuff. Just keep buying new stuff. By the way, it's better if you borrow a lot to buy new stuff. So we'll help you to borrow by reducing the interest rate. We'll keep interest rates low. We'll make the value of your assets, your houses, go up. You'll feel rich. It'll all be good. And now we are in a position where the entire system, I believe, is in danger of falling over as a result. So this is not based on empirical evidence. This is a cult, I think, that celebrates financialization of the economy. Do you remember this word financialization? What does it mean? The word financialization? Proliferation of debt and debt-like services, and the celebration of anything that's not real economy. So this idea of shuffling paper around is now more celebrated than actually making things in a factory. If you're a financier, you're likely to get a lot richer than people who operate in the real economy. So, as I say, it's a cult for rich people. It revolves around the creation of money by banks in the act of lending, which we've explained before as fractional reserve banking. So this idea that every pound or dollar that you have in your bank account, more than that pound or dollar is lent out into the real economy. So you're creating money from nothing. It leads to these boom-bust cycles, because we keep borrowing, spending, consuming, borrowing, spending, consuming, until the sort of Jenga falls over and we reset. So 2007, 2008, we had the global financial crisis. That was a reset. I fear that we may be due for another reset soon. And financialization has led to this measure called GDP, which measures the value of human society. Can someone tell me what GDP stands for?
Gross domestic product.
Yeah, gross domestic product. What does it value? What does it measure?
Well, it's supposed to measure effectively how much money is being generated by a certain economy.
Yeah, it's the value of goods and services in that economy. Yeah.
Is it linked to how much tax?
It's not necessarily a measure of that. GDP is a measure of value in goods and services. Yeah. Yeah, so I use this idea of exchange value versus experiential value. GDP measures exchange value of goods and services. It doesn't measure experiential value of goods and services. So I use two arguments or two examples to demonstrate why I think GDP is a false measure. Let's take the example of, and this is an example used by a Greek economist called Yanis Varoufakis. He wrote a very good book called, Sana, do you remember the name of the book? Talking to My Daughter About the Economy. It was a book I used to talk to my daughter about the economy. So it does what it says on the tin. It's a very good book, red cover, look for it. Yanis Varoufakis. And he uses the example of a forest fire. He says, when there's a forest fire that devastates a forest, weirdly, GDP goes up in that country. Why? Because you've got to use fuel to get to the fire. You've got to, use something to put the fire out. You've got to pay the fireman's wages. You've got to rebuild after the fire. So GDP goes up. That's kind of weird. So your country does better, apparently, according to this measure, if you had a huge forest fire that wiped up a huge part of your country somewhere. But as we know, experiential value has gone down. You no longer have a forest, right? And there's a knock-on effect for the environment. So this weird idea that GDP, this blunt measure of exchange value of goods and services, as it goes up, your country is doing better. But did GDP measure, literacy rates, environmental pollution, suicide rates, divorce rates, some kind of happiness index? It's certainly not a happiness index. Again, as human beings, we're using this one measure we have a club called the G7. And in this G7 are the top of the countries with the top 7 GDP producers in the world. It's weird, isn't it, that these are the countries we think are the ones that we should look up to, when they're the countries that are effectively enslaving the rest of the world. We talked about IMF last time. We talked about how the global north essentially has an economic power over the global south through multilaterals like the IMF, like the World Bank, like other development banks. So again, this is a function of GDP, which measures exchange value, not experiential value. And as a result of these blunt measures, we also use valuation metrics for projects that encourage high time preference, that encourage us to spend today rather than save and invest for the future. So there's something in financial circles, for example, called DCF, discounted cash flow modeling. Anyone want to have a stab? There's some accountants and financiers here.
It's the values of cash flows in the future.
Yeah.
So it brings back all the values of the cash flows
in
the next 5-10 years to today.
Yeah, so discounted cash flow modeling is a way of measuring the value of a project based on essentially how quickly it'll pay you back and make you a profit. And the sooner it pays you back and the sooner it makes you a profit, the higher the valuation of that project as a result. So the inevitable effect is it leads to things like desertification of land with intensive farming methods. So you farm this land for 5 or 10 years, but it'll be completely desertified at the end of it if you value it more highly using this DCF model. Whereas if you use common sense, you'd say, I'd like my farm to exist for 100 years or 1,000 years and be sustainable for as long as it can be sustainable without using these particular intensive farming methods. So it encourages this high time preference rather than encouraging deferred gratification and saving and investing for the future. And that's what modern financialization has done. It has adopted these models to prefer that we spend today rather than, or consume today rather than save for tomorrow. The other example I use, and the reason why I put this up on screen, is the Abraj Al Bayt project. So, I have to make a little confession now. So about 24 years ago, I worked for Deutsche Bank, and we were the first investment bank, or rather Western investment bank, to be invited into Mecca to finance a real estate project. And the project that we were asked to finance was one of the towers of Abraj al-Bayt. In fact, it is, I think it's that one over there, this one here. It's called Safa Tower. And it was meant to be a blueprint for how all of the other financing would be done in the city. So, being quite young and naive, I thought this is amazing. You know, we've been invited in as the only Western investment bank to put together a very unique type of financing. It was a sukuk, or an Islamic bond, which we talked about last time. And as you know, sukuk are supposed to be a real asset-backed type of financing. So in theory, what's meant to happen is, if you're constructing a real estate project, the sukuk investors are meant to be the owners of that project, and they're meant to take some kind of rental income or some kind of real-world profit from that project, which is great. That's all good stuff. The sukuk are meant to be real economy. Of course, last time I talked to you about how I'm concerned that sukuk have become very bond-like. So that's a different discussion. But back then, 24 years ago, we felt we were making a difference. What I hadn't quite realized was that this project was so transformative for the city that it would overshadow everything that was important about it. And it would blast the hills around Mecca into a million or billion pebbles, old fort or old Ottoman forts, old history of ours, particular, places of interest, old houses that were destroyed as a result of this modernization project. This modernization project is a result of high time preference. It is a type of thinking that says this will be good for us today and in the short-term future, but will it be good for us in the long term? I don't think I've ever met anybody who says that this is a good thing. I've never met anybody who says this is wonderful. And I mean, if you go there now, the first thing you see is this enormous. I have a second slide normally. I'm not going to do it here because I'll probably get told off. But I have a second slide that's got the clock tower in Mecca next to the Tower of Sauron from Lord of the Rings. And you wouldn't believe how similar they look. I don't know if you see this little crescent thing at the top. It actually looks like the Eye of Sauron at the top. But anyway, I've said it on camera now, so I am going to get into trouble. So it's a project in which consumerism has triumphed over long-term thinking. And as I say, a market society is basically a joyless place where exchange value is measured and not experiential value. Yeah, so the contention I make is that innovation and inventiveness of society actually decreases in a society that has a near-term preference. We prefer to spend money and replace things more frequently because money devalues quickly. And because it devalues quickly, we throw it into projects that aren't necessarily very good projects. And this is what you see with with apologies to the venture capitalists sitting in the room right now. Venture capital is, in my opinion, a rather ridiculous industry. So someone want to give me a definition of what venture capital might be? Not the venture capitalist, because he's going to reveal himself. Say again?
Are the business startups?
Yes, it does. It's a type of financing that finances startups. So it's early stage financing. And venture capital it's actually, the concept is very Islamic, because you're trying to finance entrepreneurs and inventors and people who don't have capital. You're trying to, remember this concept of mudaraba that we were talking about earlier? You're trying to bring the rab al-mal with the mudarib. And this is brilliant. This is fantastic. You're bringing investors into a venture. The challenge is that we live in a world in which money devalues so quickly that we just want to throw it into ventures as fast as possible and not leave cash sitting around devaluing. So the government tells us the inflation rate is 3% maybe. In reality, it's a lot more than that, because if you go and pick up your groceries, the basket might cost £40 this year, and maybe last year it was £30, and you're thinking, well, that's a lot more than 3%. I certainly find that whenever I pay for goods and services, I'm often left amazed as to how much it costs compared to a year ago. So I know there's something wrong with those headline figures. And that's a form of theft, actually. Inflation is a form of theft, which we're going to come on to shortly. So I've gone off on a tangent again. Venture capital, a type of financing that in theory is beneficial for society because it funds inventors and entrepreneurs, and it should encourage innovation. But what it actually does is throw a lot of money at bad projects. And you're probably seeing this now in a lot of the AI stuff that's happening. Last year it was blockchain. The year before that it was Web 3.0. The year before it was metaverse. There's always some new buzzword that we find in the industry that says this is what everybody's gravitating towards this year. And you will find that you're essentially throwing 20 darts at a dartboard and hoping one of them sticks. Whereas wouldn't it be great if we were throwing one dart at a dartboard and we do our due diligence so thoroughly on a project that hopefully each time we throw a dart we're going to hit the bullseye. That's not how the modern financial system works. Today we're trying to throw 20 darts and hoping one of them sticks somewhere. It seems to be a crazy waste of money. And we can do it because there's so much money in the economy. There's so much liquidity. And the reason why there's so much money is because there's so much lending and there's so much printing. Colloquially, we use the term printing. Right. Yeah, all right. Okay. So, this is a bit of an old photo, unfortunately, or not photo, cartoon. It's Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson. Obviously, I need to update this. It's been a while since I've updated this slide. So this is what I call the magic money tree. And I asked the question, can a monetary system encourage deferred gratification and discourage consumerism? Can a monetary system reduce inequality? What if money was merely a medium of exchange and a store of value instead of a commodity to be traded? Money has become its own commodity. We now trade cash flows. You can trade a swap. You asked me the question, I think, last time about a swap. When one trades a debt or trades an IOU or trades a cash flow, we're trading money. And that by itself is riba, because we're assigning a value to money that is greater or lesser than its par value, the value at which it was originally exchanged. You can't exchange a debt for in Islam, you can't exchange a debt for anything other than its original value. So if I owe a debt of 100 to somebody, someone else can only take that debt off me at the same value of 100. They can't pay 90 for it or 80 for it, what they call a haircut. So this idea that we now trade money as its own commodity is something inherently un-Islamic about that.
Just a question, and excuse me if I'm going off a tangent, but GDP and debt, there's these big things like the US is now, I think it's the debt's 1.5 times GDP, and I think in the UK we've gone past 1 to 1. I often hear two arguments when you're kind of listening to economists or people who are experts. One is that they're saying that it's going to come to a point where there's going to be a huge issue, and then others are like, no, it's not, because, for instance, the US doesn't pay back its debt, and it doesn't matter. I think, and I could be mistaken, but in the 2008, when Lehman Brothers got crushed, I read somewhere that a lot of the money that they had, or a lot of the investments, came from foreign money. So they're like, we'll let those guys go because. So does it matter? Does that debt to GDP actually mean anything anymore?
So I'm hoping to come on to this actually. No, but I will. I'm going to start with that actually, because so there's this idea that governments keep borrowing, they keep borrowing, and their debt burden becomes higher and higher and higher. And there is a and people say that's really bad, the system is going to fall over. And then the counter argument is it doesn't matter because we print our own money anyway. So as long as we keep printing our own money, we inflate away our debt, right? So if you had a large debt, but you also had the right to print your own money in which you were being repaid that debt, or you were repaying that debt, then you could effectively reduce that debt to zero by not even ever paying it off, but simply by keep printing more money because you've debased the value of the pound or the dollar that you print. That's why governments are not like a household. People have often used the analogy that, oh, it's just like a household. You just got to balance your income against your expenditure. That's not at all how governments think. Governments have the power to create their own money. If a household did that, then it wouldn't be a problem. You could just inflate away anything that you owe as a household. So people worry about the economy falling over because we're borrowing too much. And both sides have a point. Because if you inflate away your debt by printing more, that's great. You don't have a debt anymore, really. It's reduced effectively to zero. The problem is you've kicked the can further down the road, and any crash that does come in the future is just going to be worse. Which is why I'm a believer in a full reserve system of banking, where you lend only what you have in deposits. And actually, I also believe, because I think financial institutions should take a risk, have skin in the game in what they put money into. So even when I use the word lending, what I really mean is financing. And this idea that money itself should not be freely printable and manipulatable at will. If it's not, then governments can't simply print it to get rid of their financial worries. And I think that's a really important point that I'm going to come on to now. So, this magic money tree, how does it start? Well, in the 16th century, if you had some gold, you'd go to a goldsmith. Have I explained this analogy to you? I have. So the goldsmith stores your gold in the vault, realizes that people are not coming to redeem their gold, so keeps issuing these IOUs saying, I owe you £5 of gold. After a while, you get more pieces of paper, IOUs circulating than there are actual amounts of gold sitting in the vault. And this is essentially the genesis of the Bank of England, where you now have an institution, an organization that has the legal power to create money, these IOUs, from nothing. So that's the sort of genesis story of fractional reserve banking. Does anyone know what quantitative easing is? Yep.
So when banks purchase bonds from the central bank and vice versa.
Yeah. QE. We hear this term, quantitative easing. Again, it's a bit like pre-speaking Latin, because they like to dress up fairly simple concepts in fancy language so that lay people don't understand it. So a few years back, you would have heard this term, quantitative easing, as we were coming out of the financial crisis in 2007, 2008. And QE is a good way of governments getting themselves out of trouble in tough financial times. And it colloquially, we call it money printing, right? We don't literally print money in it. Yeah, we print some pound notes, but that's not really how the majority of money is, quote unquote, printed. And essentially, QE is the injection of new money into an economy by the central bank increasing the bank reserves, the private bank reserves. So each private bank will have a reserve. With the central bank, those numbers just go up. It's just a keystroke. And they increase the amount of reserves in these reserve accounts. So now the private sector banks have more money to play with, and they can buy more assets and increase asset prices. And also the central bank purchases bonds issued by the government. Now, of course, when a government issues bonds, a bond has an interest rate. And the more people who buy a bond, the higher the value of that bond. So whenever you buy and sell things, if there are more buyers than sellers, the value of an asset rises. So if you're selling bonds and there are more buyers of bonds than sellers of bonds, then the value of that bond will go up. It won't be 100 anymore. It'll be 101 or 102 or 103. But initially, that bond has an interest rate. So a government issues a sovereign bond, and it says, we'll issue $1 billion, we want to borrow $1 billion from the market, and we'll pay you, let's just say, 5% interest rate. If more people want that bond and the value of the bond rises, instead of being £100 par value, it goes up to 101 or 105 or 110, then effectively the interest rate that the government is paying is reduced. Because as the value of a bond rises, the effective yield, that 5%, becomes proportionately lower. So what happens is that when more people want to buy bonds, interest rates come down. So in quantitative easing, when the central bank buys government bonds, it's a bit like borrowing from Peter to pay Paul, from one pocket to the other. And the central bank is essentially a sort of quasi-government institution. So it's a bit of an artificial arrangement. But now you've got the government selling these bonds to the central bank, and the more the central bank buys, the lower the long-term interest rate, because the value of the bonds is rising. So when you lower interest rates over a long period of time, what do consumers do? We borrow more, right? If the interest rate went down from, 6% to 3%, you know, twice the number of people buying houses all of a sudden, or cars, or whatever it is, or financing luxury goods. So it makes people feel good about themselves. When a government institutes some economic policy that brings down long-term interest rates, we all go, this is fantastic. I'm going to re-elect these guys because they made me feel rich. The value of my house went up. I can borrow more. I can consume more. I can spend more. And this cycle of borrow, spend, consume means that we're locked into a cycle of materialism and consumerism. So we're effectively trying to maintain infinite growth on a finite planet, which clearly is against the laws of nature. It's impossible to do that. But that's what modern economics does. It encourages us to borrow, spend, consume by lowering long-term interest rates. And QE does exactly this. They say that they're stimulating the economy, and they call it money printing. But really, it's a magic trick. Yeah? Houses, cars, financial stocks, these will all go up. And we're told that this is a good thing. But what we don't understand, that this is basically a stealth tax. We're being taxed. So when we go to Sainsbury's and we pay £40 instead of £30, that inflation is a way of stealing from our wages, because our wages haven't gone up as much. Our wages tend to go up slower than the rate of inflation, or the real rate of inflation. And therefore, people at the bottom of the pyramid, which is the general public, feel the effect of inflation a lot more than people at the top of the pyramid, the ones who are closer to the money spigot, the tap of money from the central bank. Because the moment that money is printed, the ones who are closest to it, which is the bankers, the financiers, the venture capitalists, the private equity people, they're the guys who have immediate access to it. If you're an ultra high net worth individual, you have access to borrowing before anybody else. By the time that money is filtered down to the bottom of the pyramid, the ordinary people, we're paying a lot more for our goods and services, but we're not being paid our wages as much. It's called the Cantillon effect. The further you are away from the money spigot, the tap, the greater the inequality between those at the top and those at the bottom. That's how the modern system works, and therefore it's a stealth tax. So once upon a time, governments would finance war with whatever was in their own treasury chest, whatever money or gold, as they had back then, they could use to finance a war. Once they discovered this alchemy, this magic trick of the magic money tree, they realized they could print as much money as they wanted and finance an infinite perpetual state of war. So since President Nixon removed the gold peg from the US dollar in 1971 to finance the Vietnam War, the US has engaged in something like 250 plus conflicts around the world. It's just a perpetual state of war. And they can do that because the US dollar is the world's dominant currency, and they can print it at will. Right, so essentially, we're saying that fiat money is created from debt. It's riba by design. Its supply is effectively infinite, and it's permissioned by a small group of people. So in the US, that's the Fed. And therefore, it can be reversed or censored. If you are Iran or Afghanistan or Venezuela or any country in the world that the US doesn't like, you can be sanctioned, you can be censored, you can be cut off the banking rails, the SWIFT payment banking rails. Your ability to move capital is restricted. And it's a very effective way of one nation controlling the rest of the world. It's not really freedom money, this idea that the US and the UK are these upholders of the standards of freedom in the world, I think is a joke. You know, it's very amusing that everybody's drunk the Kool-Aid, and you know, in the West we think that the West is this standard bearer of democracy and human rights and freedom, but it's exactly the opposite, because this currency is a means of enslaving the rest of the world. But because many people in our countries, in the US and the UK, are comfortable and they lead a comfortable life, they don't realize the damage that we cause to the rest of the world. I find it fascinating, actually. Some of the most intelligent people I know, you know, they don't recognize that our monetary system is the reason why the rest of the world is enslaved, because they're comfortable, because they live in nice houses, because they have good jobs, because they have nice cars, because, you know, their kids go to nice schools. So they say, well, you know, the system's working for me. I can't see what's wrong with the world. But they never really take a step back and say, what's happening in the rest of the world? What if the rest of the world had a form of money that they could use that couldn't be manipulated, that couldn't be censored or sanctioned, that wasn't freely printed by a small group of people, that didn't have permission to change that money by a small group of people, that was completely decentralized, which is going to lead me on to my next point. Okay, let's talk about sound money. So anyone want to take a stab at what this phrase means? Sound money. What do we think this means?
Backed by something tangible.
Okay, let's try that. Tangible. Sound money, is it backed by something tangible? Explain to me what you mean by that.
You know, if it's you could assign a certain value to something, so you could something like gold or
right. So it's backed by a real commodity, something you can see, touch, and feel. Okay, tangibility. What about
It's not inflationary.
okay? Okay, deflationary. It doesn't inflate away like modern money does. What else? What's sound money?
it's not influenced by the government.
Yep. Okay, manipulatable. It can't be censored, it can't be sanctioned, it can't be influenced by one group of people or a government. What else is sound money?
Is it anything to do with liquidity? It's easy to move around.
Yes, that's a good one. I'm going to call that something. I'm going to call it saleability. Saleability. I don't think there's an E in there. Is there an E in saleability? What else? And I'm going to explain what saleability means in a minute. Yeah.
It takes efforts to get it.
Yes. I'm going to use the word energy. In fact, I'm going to use a different word. I'm going to use the word proof of work. Okay. Proof of work / energy. I think that's an important concept. What else?
Can't make money from that money.
I'm just going to use the word riba. So let's say anti-riba. Anti-riba. Okay, what else?
Also a consensus among people to use that.
I'm going to use the word decentralized. Yeah. Okay, what else? Okay, we got 10 minutes.
I think it's a fancy word, but fungible basically means that it's identical across all mediums.
So if I had one £10 note, it looks like any other £10 note. Fungibility is this idea that money is one piece of money is the same as another piece of money. So whatever we choose, if our money was seashells, as long as one seashell looked and felt like another seashell, that's fungible, right? Whereas if you used dates as money, for example, the quality of dates varies. So you could have, one type of date and another type of date. They wouldn't necessarily be the same. What else do we have?
It's scarce. You can't
Scarce, yeah. This is great. You guys have been reading stuff before you came here. We actually got most of them. One that I don't necessarily agree with is tangible. But that might be a controversial opinion. A few days ago, there was a fatwa, apparently from Mufti Taqi Usmani, who many of you know is one of the world's leading scholars in many respects, actually. And everybody started sending me this fatwa saying, look, see, Taqi Usmani says you're wrong. So I have some views on this. So the fatwa was about Bitcoin. And I'm going to come to Bitcoin in a minute. And on this board, you'll see a description of how Bitcoin, the US dollar, or I'll use the word fiat, and gold vary, and the differences between them, and the characteristics of each type of money. But this fatwa was interesting because basically it was a rehash of the same fatwa that was done by his students, not by him, several years ago. So another one of his students had decided, I'm just going to rehash this fatwa, get his signature on it, and then I'm going to issue it to all the press. And now I've got all sorts of people sending me, you know, newspaper clippings from Dawn newspaper in Pakistan saying, hey, look, Taqi Usmani says you're an idiot. But what's actually happened is they have rehashed exactly the same fatwa from several years ago without doing any new research. I also happen to know a mufti in the UK called Mufti Faraz Adam. Some of you may have heard of him. Young guy, very capable, very knowledgeable about this subject, who presented to the same group of students of the Mufti Taqi Usmani very recently, like within the last few weeks, in which I think he got through to them. But this research was conducted, so-called research, was conducted before that conversation took place. They are about 10 years behind the curve. And I'm sorry to say, ulama in general are about 10 years behind the curve on this. And they keep rehashing the same generic fatwas about money and sound money and gold and Bitcoin. And I want to try and debunk a little bit of this today. I'm wondering whether we should stop there and you can change round. Yeah, okay. We'll take a 5-10 minute break. All good? Yeah, we're back. Great. So we were talking about sound money. We talked about it can't be manipulated, that it is decentralized, that it requires proof of work or energy to extract it, like gold from the ground, that it's fungible, one piece of money looks like another piece of money, that it is anti-riba, that you can't create it from nothing, that it's scarce and finite, so there's not an infinite amount of it about, or you can't print it infinitely. And this idea of tangibility is an interesting one. So many people think that money, especially Muslims, think that money should be tangible. There's a famous hadith about the exchange of money from one person to the other. It should be hand to hand. In other words, it's spot value. And the 6 ribawi items that are mentioned in the hadith are gold, silver, barley, wheat, dates, and salt. Now that doesn't mean that dates is a sound form of money, or that those 6 things are the only form of money. Of course, that's not what that hadith means. Some people think that's what that hadith means. And they further extrapolate and say only gold and silver are the true money of Islam, which again, there's no scriptural basis for that. People say it because they've heard of gold and silver in various references. So money can be anything we want by social acceptance, by urf, social custom. If we choose to use seashells on a Pacific island as our form of money, that may be a form of money. We can use that. There's social agreement amongst ourselves that we can use it as a form of money. Similarly, if we are in a World War II prisoner of war camp, we might use cigarettes as a form of money. So this idea that money has to be something real and tangible with intrinsic value. What is intrinsic value? Someone tell me what's intrinsic value.
I guess the value that's derived from the commodity itself.
Right. What's the intrinsic value of a glass of water?
It can replenish, provide certain
Right.
biological.
What about diamonds? Intrinsic value of diamonds?
There isn't a huge amount. I feel like society might have. I mean, well, you can use it as a tool, potentially.
Perceived value?
Yes. I don't think there's any such thing as intrinsic value, because if I'm dying of thirst in a desert, diamonds are worthless to me. There might be £1 million in Amsterdam, but they're worthless to me in the desert. I'd rather have a glass of water. So that glass of water is worth a lot more to me. So there's no such thing as intrinsic value. All value is subjective, of everything. So this idea that money has to be backed by something real and corporeal that I can see, touch, and feel, I don't believe in it. I don't see any evidence scripturally as to why it has to be backed by something. And many scholars will say, oh, no, it has to be. I remember many years back, one very famous scholar in this country, he did a 16-minute long rant to video about why Bitcoin was haram according to him. And every single statement he made was essentially, factually incorrect. He demonstrated immediately in almost every sentence that he said a complete misunderstanding of the modern economic, monetary, and financial system. And that was the basis on which he made his fatwa. I believe that causes great harm to people, right? Yeah, so where does this journey start for me is 2017. I'm delivering a lecture about Islamic finance, and somebody in the audience asks me what I think about Bitcoin. And I say, I don't really know anything about Bitcoin. I heard it's some kind of magic internet money. And then he tries to explain it to me. And he says, well, you know, it's decentralized, it's fungible, it's secure, it can't be manipulated, it requires proof of work, you need energy to dig it out, and it's scarce and it's finite. So it has a high stock to flow ratio. In other words, there's a lot of it, but there's very little flow of it. So like gold, there's a lot of it, but it only extracted from the ground at a rate of sort of 1.5% per annum. That's a high stock to flow ratio. It implies scarcity and finiteness. So he said all this to me in the Q&A session of this lecture. And I said, wow, well, that sounds a little bit like gold to me. It's like a digital form of gold. And he says, yeah, it's like gold, but better. So I said, look, I don't really understand it, and I need to go away and research it, which is unfortunately not what scholars are doing today. They're not doing their research. They're not studying this subject, and they need to do their 100 hours or 1,000 hours or whatever the number is. And they're coming up with their fatwa saying it's haram because, and then they say, because the government doesn't back it. Where is a government required to back money in order for it to be considered money? Show me where in Quran and Hadith it actually says that. It doesn't. Why do you think that a government backs your pound note? It doesn't. If you read the Bank of England's own quarterly bulletin, I think it was 2014 quarter one, look it up. The Bank of England itself recognizes that money is created ex nihilo, from nothing. And the government doesn't stand behind it. So if a shopkeeper decided to refuse your £10 note, he is entirely within the law to do that. He doesn't have to accept your £10. If he doesn't have faith in the money, remember this word credere, to believe, credit, to have faith in something. Money is created from credit. If you don't have faith in the money, you don't have to accept it. If the pound were to collapse overnight, I wouldn't have to receive pounds from you for goods and services. I could say I want it in dollars or in Bitcoin or in gold or in seashells. Whatever we decide amongst ourselves is money. I don't have to take, there's no government backing behind it. So these scholars who say it's backed by something real, the government undertakes to do something, to do nothing of the sort. There is no undertaking by a government.
So what we're saying is money isn't backed by government, it's backed by trust.
Correct.
Which is what
100% trust.
the paper notes, it's all based on trust.
It's all based on trust. We use the US dollar because it's based on trust.
Do the circumstances that Bitcoin emerged through not alarm you in the sense that I remember you previously mentioned that you were worried about the community being surveilled. Is there no risk of that with Bitcoin given all transactions are publicly recorded?
So Bitcoin is pseudonymous, meaning that my name is not associated with the transaction. Okay. So they can't see, just looking at the pool of transactions which is public, they can't see who is actually making those transactions.
Is there no way for them to reverse engineer that?
If I decided to do my transactions on an exchange, then yes. But if I decide to do it peer-to-peer, then they can't tell.
Okay. Last week I asked, in especially Gulf countries, for example, like Saudi, the Saudi Riyal has a conventional peg, a fixed peg
to the dollar.
US dollar.
Yeah.
So which isn't a sound money by any means. So
yeah.
Why do scholars say it's permissible to use the US dollar?
Because they don't know any better. Because this new technology has emerged, and I'm going to show you the next slide. Oh no, I actually removed it. I have a slide in here. Maybe I hid it and I forgot. I have a slide in here that shows the printing press, that shows taps in a mosque to do wudu. Did you know that early scholars wouldn't allow taps to be used for wudu? Because it was an innovation, right? And it was only the Hanafi scholars who allowed it, and taps were known as Hanafiya in the Arab world for a long time as a result. So, scholars have this previous history of banning new technology. They've done it with loudspeakers, with telegraph poles, with television, printing press, which is controversial, by the way, because others will say, oh, it wasn't the scholars who did that, it was the Ottoman rulers. Some will say, well, the scholars encouraged it because it was good for them. I think they had a part to play in that. But this idea that we weren't allowed to use guns on the battlefield, only swords, because the scholars told us that was the the Sunnah way of fighting. I mean, you're just asking for trouble, aren't you? You're going to become slaves. If you've devolved all your thinking to somebody else, then you're going to end up a slave. Please?
Coffee was also banned.
Coffee, yes, good one. Yes, it was. Yeah. So, look, I have to be very careful because I often get in trouble. People say, "Oh, brother, you can't disrespect the scholars. You cannot criticize them." Of course you can. They're human beings. I mean, they make mistakes just like us. And when they are delivering fatwa, which are based on, frankly, misinformation, completely factually incorrect, you have to call it out. It's your duty to. If they tell you the government backs money, that's just nonsense. It doesn't. If they tell you it's something real, it isn't real. It's digits in a computer. They say that Bitcoin is not real. But I say, how real is your bank account? Again, that's just numbers in a computer. They don't actually have pound notes sitting in a vault somewhere with your name on it. It's less real because it's more susceptible to be manipulated by people, by a small group of people. So I do this comparison between Bitcoin, gold, and fiat. And I talk about durability and portability and fungibility and verifiableness and divisibility and scarceness, censorship resistance. I think that the dollar is the most easily censored and sanctioned currency. It's not scarce at all. It's infinitely printable. It's based on riba. It's created out of riba. It's literally riba money. So, if we are to say that Bitcoin is haram, then why aren't we also saying that the US dollar is haram? Gold has traditionally been the money of Islamic civilization. So we had 700 years of the Islamic dinar, during which we had a low time preference period, where we had time and space to pursue higher things: science, literature, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, engineering, agriculture. We were the world leaders in everything because we created a society with incentives to plan for the future using a low time preference form of money that was scarce, that was divisible, that was saleable across time and space. If you held 10 grams of gold in the year 600 of the Common Era, 10 grams of gold today would be worth not a million miles different, right? And we can actually verify this through hadith about the value of livestock, for example. Whereas if I held $100 at the beginning of the 20th century, by the end of the 20th century, it's worth $4. I've lost 96% that the government stole from me. So you may know that in 1933, Roosevelt expropriated citizens' gold. He essentially bought it back at a knockdown price and made it illegal for citizens to own gold. So that's the government telling you you're not allowed to use something as money. They're telling you you can't use gold, which has been money for 5,000 years. So that's the first step. And then by 1971, we've got Nixon telling us the US dollar doesn't really exist anymore. There's nothing to back it. There's no gold behind it. I can print it at will. I can finance the Vietnam War. And now I can finance 250 more wars. So that's the result of fiat money. Whereas gold has traditionally been a natural brake on the ability of governments to finance war and white elephant projects. It means you had 700 years of development in the Islamic world that was unrivaled. And now we've gone back to a world where we've become economic slaves. There's this point that I make about free markets, by the way, and the protection of property rights. People say, is Islam socialist? Is it capitalist? Well, it's neither. It is its own economic ideology. And in fact, believe it or not, we believe in free markets. There's a very famous hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ is asked to, it's a time of rising commodity prices, and people are very worried, and they come to him and they say, can you fix the prices for us? And he thinks about it and he says, no, I can't fix the prices, because prices are in the hands of Allah, and if I were to set them for you, I would be in danger of creating a great injustice on the people. So he wouldn't set the prices. Even at a time at which they were spiraling out of control and the people were struggling to make ends meet, he realized that if you didn't allow prices to be set naturally, effectively by Allah, then you are creating an injustice in the world. So we don't believe in centrally planned prices. We believe in free markets. That's a key criterion for Islamic markets. What do we have next? Yeah, I want to try and wrap up fairly soon. Yeah, so this idea of is Bitcoin Sharia compliant? So we've talked about saleability across time and space. We talked about resistance to manipulation, to censorship. Does anyone want to talk about the common arguments as to why Bitcoin is not a good type of money? By the way, whenever I talk about Bitcoin, I don't talk about crypto. Just want to be clear that I don't believe in 99% of crypto. I consider to be a scam or a project designed to enrich a small group of people. I'm only talking about Bitcoin as a completely separate subject. But let's hear some arguments against Bitcoin as a form of money.
It's too volatile.
Yep, that's a good one. Volatile. What are?
Not regulated.
Regulation.
So what Warren Buffett was saying, at the end of the day, I need someone to accept this, to buy something from him.
Okay, so social acceptance.
Accessibility.
So how do I want to... Ease of use, let's call it that. Ease of use.
It's susceptible to surveillance as well.
Yeah.
The fatwa, the recent one, said it isn't legal counsel my wealth.
Okay.
Made by the CIA.
Yeah, that's a good one, by the way. I like that. Great. That is actually really good.
That is not tangible.
Yep. Got so many reasons not to adopt Bitcoin.
Can be used for criminal activity. I think it runs 5 more seconds. Can I? Looking at from the lens of environmental, it's energy intensive.
Yeah. Altaf?
I said it's not regulated, but it's attached to blockchain, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to go down that route. Is that a form of regulation, i.e. is traceable?
That's what I'm going to talk about, exactly that. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, I might stop there because I've run out of space on the board. So obviously there's a huge amount of concern that, I mean, there are many arguments as to why Bitcoin is not a good form of money. And I might try and tick off each of these because there is a rebuttal to each of these, actually. And unfortunately, I don't think people are really engaging with this subject properly, particularly the scholars. I think that they've seen these headlines, they've read newspaper reports, they haven't read the works of qualified people. They haven't consulted with qualified people, and they've made, frankly, knee-jerk reactions to something they haven't quite understood. Let's talk about each of these in turn. Let's start with the environment, actually. So there is this argument that Bitcoin mining uses up the energy of a small country, and that was certainly true at some certain point. However, the proportion of carbon emissions and energy usage is much higher from renewable sources than other industries. So the banking industry uses many multiples carbon emissions compared to Bitcoin. The gold mining industry is again a order of magnitude higher. If Bitcoin were to replace fiat money and banking intermediaries, you would actually have a significant net saving of energy. So if it was a genuine alternative to the current monetary system, it encourages the use of renewable sources, stranded sources, which brings down the overall carbon emissions. And I often use this point that things that you need require energy. So I often ask the question, why is energy usage bad? I mean, we need to travel to places to go to work. We need to use computers and television. We watch YouTube. YouTube has an energy usage, which by the way is massive. The fashion industry has an enormous energy usage, but I don't hear people complaining about the energy usage of the fashion industry. Personally, I just think, why do you need such a carbon-intensive industry, which is, frankly, to me, subjectively, I don't assign value to the fashion industry. But some people might, and I have to recognize that. Some people like this, but they don't like that. I happen to think that a form of money is an important tool for society to function. A good form of money is a tool for society to function. And tools require energy usage. And if we think that this tool is a good one, and the energy is used to secure the network, meaning it can't be attacked and changed and manipulated, then I think that's a good use of energy. And if that energy is replacing some other energy usage, such as banks as financial intermediaries, or global trade, or foreign exchange, or gold mining industry, then again, that's a net energy positive. Yeah.
Quite a thought-provoking statement you made there, where you said the energy required for the production of Bitcoin, if that was to replace what we use in, say, the banking sector, is that statement backed up? I'm not saying obviously you don't say things that aren't backed up, but that's quite a statement, because historically people have talked about Bitcoin mining has been wasting energy, as you sort of alluded to, and it requires too much energy, and that energy could be used for better uses elsewhere.
So that's a good argument. So the question is, this idea that Bitcoin has been using so much energy in mining it out of these computers, however it works, why is that a good use of energy? And what I say is that it's a good use of energy. It has been historically a good use of human energy to extract gold from the ground and use it as money. And it was a good form of money. But today I don't believe it is a good form of money anymore, because it's easily manipulated. For example, Venezuela tried to get their gold back from the Bank of England. The Bank of England said no, and Venezuela couldn't get their own gold back from. So it's manipulated. It's held in, by a few custodians around the world. So is there a form of money that is better for the majority of human beings on this planet? I believe there is. I think it's Bitcoin. I might be wrong, but I'm prepared to make that initial sacrifice to see if it works. And I believe that human beings need to research the monetary system. They need to understand how it works, why the way it works today is not a good way for humanity in general, why it benefits a small group of people in favor and over a large group of people, and therefore why it's important that we spend some time and effort and energy today to secure an alternative form of a monetary system. That's why I believe it's a good usage of energy. And I don't think it'll be a permanent energy sink forever. I think we have been in a phase of mining. There's 1 million coins left to be mined, which over time, sorry, there is a question over here. Yeah. You were going to say?
That the amount of Bitcoin is finite, so
yes.
You want to mine it.
Yes.
Well, apart from the fact they say that it takes even more energy now to mine, so in the early years it required less. And so the marginal effort to produce those final.
So how is that energy manifested? How much carbon emissions are coming out of that? The answer is proportionately much less, because a very large proportion is from renewable energy sources and stranded energy. And actually it encourages the grid to move towards renewable energy sources. So there's a net positive externality, as economists call it. In other words, there's an outcome here, not directly related to Bitcoin itself, which is that we end up using greener forms of energy worldwide. Which is a very powerful argument, but nobody uses it. Oh, sorry, there's one more thing. All of this discussion around energy usage of Bitcoin stems from one report about several years ago now. It's a long, long time ago. And that report was produced by a group of badly informed undergraduates as part of a report that they were asked to do as an assignment by their lecturer. And for whatever reason, it got picked up by a scientific journal. For whatever reason, I don't know why they did. And then that report got cited in every newspaper and press column thereafter. So for years, you had this false report perpetuated that Bitcoin is using the same amount of energy as Argentina or whatever, and it does this and it does that. But anybody who really understood the subject looked at it and said, there's something fundamentally wrong there. Whoever did this research clearly wasn't doing the analysis correctly. And that report has persisted and perpetuated, and everybody keeps citing that it's, Bitcoin is bad because it uses this much energy, and look, this report said it. Apparently a peer-reviewed report. But it wasn't, it was a group of people who weren't qualified to do it. Yeah.
So I work in sustainability, and carbon is my expertise in construction. I think the thing that I would say about carbon emissions and energy and environmental issues is working in the industry, the majority of it is backed by some kind of agenda or propaganda. The same people will tell you Bitcoin is really bad are the same people that say, but we can't talk about the military carbon emissions, which are ridiculous because safety or whatever. Construction is in charge of about 40% of global carbon emissions, yet there's hardly any data actually recorded.
Yeah.
It's all really based on theory. So all I would say is look at every source and do your research properly, because there's so much agenda. I mean, electric vehicles, we talk about how great they are, but no one talks about the lithium, the mining, and what happens to the batteries. So I just think when it comes to that,
it's all headline issues and sound bites, isn't it?
Sound bites, and most of it is backed by actual falsities. So look into that.
And who perpetuates these falsities? So in the case of Bitcoin, it's the IMF and the World Bank.
Exactly.
It's in their interest to tell you that Bitcoin is bad.
Yeah, look at who it is and what their agenda is.
Yeah.
Because when it comes to sustainability, the majority of it is myth.
Yeah.
Well, I think gold in principle should be better than Bitcoin. But now that we are not the people who are fair in power, we have a problem. So Bitcoin could actually be a solution. If it is not the solution, what could it be? So
I think you're absolutely right. People ask, is Bitcoin Sharia compliant? Is it real? It's real for the Palestinians, by the way. So I'm sure we all try to make donations to Gaza. And if you try and make donations through normal banking channels, it gets blocked immediately. Immediately you can't send it. And I remember I had a friend in Gaza who was receiving donations, and he was buying food and aid and medicines on the ground. And every single time he gave you a new bank account number, immediately got blocked. So the banking rails won't allow you a free system of sending money around the world. There was only two ways to get money in. One was Tether, and the other was Bitcoin. There's only two ways to get money into Gaza. So you're absolutely right. It's a form of freedom money. In this so-called free West and free world, we have the most manipulated and, it's a form of economic slavery. Also, 100% agree. Energy is not my subject, but I can see immediately that it's a subject that is ruled by ideology. And if somebody has a particular ideological position, they'll manipulate that argument to reinforce that ideological position. And that's been the case with Bitcoin. And every time you hear Christine Lagarde, for example, she has been a very anti-Bitcoin person and continually cites these environmental so-called reports, which are based on the original mistaken report. Please.
So you mentioned the ECB. What do you think about them and CBDCs?
Yeah, I have a real fear that, so CBDCs are central bank digital currencies, and we might be hearing about Bitcoin. We might have heard about this. We might have heard about other coins being produced by governments around the world. And this idea of CBDC, central bank digital currency, is basically fiat in an ultra surveillance form. So if you thought that you were being monitored closely whenever you went to your bank to get some money out, or when you made a large transaction, they're asking, where is it going? What are you using it for? Your name is Muhammad. That sounds a bit dodgy to me. This will be far worse, because now you'll have governments there's no intermediary, there's no bank in the middle. It'll be the government directly seeing where you were spending your money, how you were spending your money. that you went to an Islamic bookshop at 4:02 p.m. on Saturday. They can see everything about you. Everything is time stamped, location stamped. I don't like CBDCs. And I think people who are advocating for CBDCs, because they're saying, oh, look, it's digital money, therefore it's great, it's efficient, it's fast, it's cost effective, it's speedy, blah, blah, blah. But it's still the same money. It's the dollar or the pound. It makes the problems of fiat money even worse than they already are. It just makes it an efficient way for the government to surveil you. So I'm extremely anti-CBDCs as a result.
So why Bitcoin? And I know we said there's 21 million and there.
Yeah.
I would say that the CBDCs are a no-go. But why this cryptocurrency? Why not?
Because it's decentralized.
None of it is decentralized.
No.
Okay.
So the analogy I use for Muslims is the Quran is a decentralized book. It's a ledger. It's a decentralized ledger technology. And in Bitcoin, you have these things called nodes, which is a computer that stores all the transactions. And you've got maybe 10,000 nodes around the world. And you have to have multiple parties verify a transaction to know that it's a real transaction. So you don't have the double spend problem. In other words, the same Bitcoin can't be spent twice, right? This is to secure Bitcoin and make it a real form of money. Now, imagine that you want to memorize the Quran. That's a very energy-intensive process. And you can't just go to one book that's stored somewhere, maybe it's stored in Mecca in a glass box, and that's the original definitive Quran, and we all look at that and say, okay, this is correct, Fatiha is written correct, compare it against this one, that's correct. No, the reason why the Quran is protected and secured for us is because it's in our heads. And there are 2 billion people around the world who know something of it. And actually, when you go into any mosque during Ramadan, you stand in Taraweeh, there are probably 5 or 6 people in the front row alone who've memorized it. So if the Imam makes a mistake, there's 5 or 6 people who can immediately correct him. Every single punctuation mark, every single letter has been memorized from start to finish. That's why the Quran is protected. And that's a decentralized network, and that required proof of work, energy. Individuals had to spend years memorizing it before they were qualified, before they were able to correct an Imam on the front row during Ramadan. So this decentralization, this decentralized ledger technology is very simple, similar to how the blockchain works. A blockchain is a decentralized ledger. That means that multiple nodes contain the history of all transactions. And if one of them deviates by one letter or one punctuation mark, all the other nodes will step in and say, you're wrong, and you can't double spend this coin. That's why I believe that Bitcoin cannot be manipulated. It would require what's called a 51% attack, which means you'd have to control the computing power. And the resources and the money and the technology now needed to control 51% would go beyond the resources of the 2 largest nations, maybe more. It would be virtually impossible now to control the network. So it's truly decentralized. So one individual can't be prevented from sending another individual their Bitcoin.
When you say control the network, do you mean in terms of the ownership or control of those coins? Because I know the US government and in the UK as well, they've done a lot of seizures of companies and taken the coins. So do you mean the sort of nodes?
So when the FBI or whoever seizes coins from ill-gotten gains, what they're usually doing is seizing from an exchange, which is it's an intermediary. Or they can get the exchange to share the private keys of a particular stash of coins. But that's not the same as you and I self-custodying our coins. So I hold them myself, and only I, in my head, hold a seed phrase of 24 words that allow me access to my Bitcoin, and you similarly. So we both self-custody. There's nobody in between us. There's no exchange between us, and we can just transfer coins between us. And that's the beauty of it. We're each our own personal Swiss private bank. We don't need anybody else in between.
What happens when the usual thing happens in situations? Something good, decent, productive, meets all the requirements, is working, capitalism gets involved, big banks.
Yeah.
What's the difference between a bank validating and if exchanges have enough sort of funds under their management, they can effectively influence whatever they want.
Yeah, so I fear that. I do fear now we are moving into a phase where there's a danger that the BlackRocks and the Goldman Sachs will have an influence on the development of Bitcoin. That's what I fear. And you mentioned earlier CIA. So the reason why this young man said that the CIA is a potential criticism of Bitcoin is because there's a narrative that the original algorithm, which is the open architecture coding that defines how Bitcoin works, was developed by the CIA, or at least the kernel of it was developed by the CIA. So there's this narrative that this is actually a big psyop, you know.
10 Japanese man who made it. It's just a story.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of confusing narratives out there. I think a lot of them are put out there in order to discourage people to choose something freely of their own will as a form of money. And I think everybody should go out and do their own research and understand, why are these narratives out there? Who do they come from? Why are people incentivized to say certain things? Why is Christine Lagarde incentivized to say, don't use Bitcoin, use the euro? You know, there's clearly an incentive on her to say that.
So you know when, well, they probably still do have some sanctions. When Iran had the sanctions on, they were charging people for passage on the Strait of Hormuz with tether.
Yeah.
But like tether's pegged to
The US dollar. Yeah.
The CEO's like on some advisory board with Trump.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
it's all connected.
So as you say, I advocate for cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
All cryptocurrency I consider to be something manipulatable. Whereas Bitcoin, I consider the network effect is so large now, and it's so decentralized, and it's so resistant to censorship and sanctions, that I consider it to be the best form of money today. Except for some of these criticisms that people rightly said. It's volatile. So we only covered the first one. It's volatile. Yeah, on a day-to-day basis. Its value against fiat currencies is moving up and down very fast. So I'd say a couple of things. Number one, it's fairly early days. It's still in a price discovery phase, right? And this is a multi-decade long project, I believe, before it will settle. And actually, if you overlaid a graph of Bitcoin volatility against gold after 1971, the graphs would be very similar. So gold also very volatile, decreasing over time. Now Bitcoin's currently at the volatility level of tech stocks, and it's decreasing all the time. So I believe that it will become something that we can start to use on a day-to-day basis, maybe not today, but perhaps sometime soon in the future. That's how I feel about it. And by the way, so one more thing, the volatility is on the upside. People say it's volatile, but it's actually gradually moving this way, right? People forget that. They're like, oh, it's too volatile, I can't use it. Yeah, but if you held it for any 3-year period, it's always going to be positive. That's what's happened so far.
And is there any concern to the majority holders of Bitcoin?
So this comes back to this argument about, you know, you got BlackRock involved and you got JP Morgan is finally getting involved. Jamie Dimon, of course, the CEO of JP Morgan, originally said that he would fire any trader who held Bitcoin. Right? He said this a few years ago. He called it a total scam. And now they're one of the biggest proponents of it. Right? People change their minds. Right? So Wall Street has seen that there's money to be made here. And so they're producing paper Bitcoin, meaning ETFs. Remember these exchange-traded funds I talked about? These funds that you can buy on a stock exchange, and they hold something behind them. In this case, Bitcoin. You have Bitcoin ETFs. Well, that's why BlackRock is one of the biggest holders of Bitcoin, or they custody it through somebody else. They're one of the biggest holders because they produce a Bitcoin ETF. So retail people can come who don't want to get involved in the complexities of self-custody and how does this work? And it's like the early days of the internet. Nobody knew how it worked, right? But now you just use your browser on your iPad. You don't have to know how the internet works.
I think with the statement, is it Sharia compliant? I think the interesting thing is, I've been really interested in Bitcoin for a long time, since 2010, right? And it's had its transitions, it's had its phases. And I think looking at all those requirements which we talked about, which meet sound money, it's changed massively. Like right at the very start, it had certain massive benefits, yet where yes, it is Sharia compliant in these aspects, but then there's also the list of cons. And I think where we've got to at this point in time, I feel like I asked before, I feel like the same thing with Islamic finance.
Yes.
Banks have seen it
been corrupted.
Not so much about the ideology that I see behind Bitcoin and why it's good for society, but more so it's time to make money. So let's shift this into the frameworks which meet our requirements. So I think, yeah, it's a very scary thing.
So I am concerned about where Bitcoin is today, because I see I see Wall Street moving in. And on the one hand, there's an advantage because Trump says this and Wall Street says that, and retail says, oh, this is interesting, I better get in on it. I like that because now there's interest from ordinary people. Yeah. Now they want to get in on it. And I want ordinary people to hold this. I want ordinary people to benefit. I want them to claw back the lost ground against the Elon Musks of the world, right, who have made a lot of money from fiat money. Like, we just have this idea that Elon Musk is this great businessman, but he's made his money by government subsidies. He's not a free market guy. None of these guys are free market. They made their money from subsidies. And if we want to claw back free markets where society deems something to be money, well, we can all be saved from this Cantillon effect, where people at the top are close to the money printer, people at the bottom are far away from it. So they get the money before we do, and by the time inflation has happened, our purchasing power is reduced. That's why I want people to have... So on the one hand, I'm happy that there's this institutional interest and they're now providing Bitcoin ETFs. And on the other hand, I'm thinking, well, hang on, Wall Street's now muscling in. What's going to happen next? I don't know. But I have to hope and believe in something, and this is the best thing I can hope and believe for, right? I know, exactly.
Is the reason tangibility is emphasized then because of those risks that you're talking about? And I also think that, I know you said there's no scriptural basis, but
yeah.
Dinar and dirham are both actually like explicitly mentioned in the Quran
as
like physical objects.
Okay.
And if you look across the Quran, it's very rare that there's an object explicitly called out in that way.
Yeah.
So some people view that as some sort of divine acknowledgement.
Yeah, I don't know why though. I just don't get it, because that's why we had the printing press banned and televisions and loudspeakers and guns on a battlefield. Yeah. I mean, we're walking towards our own doom because we're being led by people who are causing us serious harm. So stop listening to them is what I say. Yeah. Because by telling them that there's no solid scriptural basis for only using gold, you're not wrong. And they haven't produced any evidence otherwise.
So it sounds like Bitcoin could be a savior in terms of a method of exchange and trade and versus fiat currency. Listening to what you mentioned earlier about Roosevelt and gold, is there a risk, or is there...
that it could be repossessed?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think as long as you self-custody, there's no way anyone can get hold of it, unless they held a gun to your head and said, tell me your 24-word seed phrase, right? So that's why I think it's secure.
And I guess touching on the point of decentralization, so I think that gold example that you gave, I think you said Roosevelt said you can't trade in it, or you bought it at a discounted price. If it's all decentralized, then are we then saying the government or whoever else it may not be able to do that because effectively it's all off and you're trading amongst each other?
Yeah, correct, absolutely.
Just very quickly, do you, for those of us that do own Bitcoin or parts of Bitcoin, is your, maybe not advice, but better to have it on a cold wallet rather than on an exchange? Yeah,
don't leave any coins on an exchange.
Okay.
Yeah, always a cold wallet. Okay. Easy to buy. You know, there are companies like Trezor and Ledger who sell these little look like thumb drives, and they contain your private encryption keys. Very well protected. Always have it unplugged from your computer, sitting somewhere in a safe or whatever. Bury it in your back garden, whatever. But you know, that's how you make sure nobody can get hold of it. But if you leave them on an exchange, people talk about security. They say, oh, Bitcoin can be hacked. Well, Bitcoin itself can't be hacked, but an exchange can be hacked. It's like the Wild West at the moment. You can walk into a bank with a gun and say, you know, give me all the dollars in your safe. But that's what you do when you leave your money on an exchange.
Is that a concern then, that someone could put me at gunpoint and take my crypto?
They can do that with anything, though. Yeah. You can't prevent against human violence, but you can put as many controls as you can. I'm going to try and run through some more of these. Regulation. So yeah, Bitcoin is not regulated. That's why institutional money is getting in on the act, so they can create products that are regulated. I would very much like money to be free, you know, by and for the people. I would not like regulation for money. I think money as a medium of exchange should not be regulated. That's my feeling. By design, it is separating state and money, and I believe the two should be separated. Social acceptance, it's not currently socially accepted. You know, you can't freely exchange it with people. I can't buy a coffee in the local coffee shop with it. That's true. But as I say, we're relatively early in the price discovery phase. And I think over time, more and more, I tend to be using it now for some things. Not many things, but for some things. Adoption is essentially the same thing. Ease of use. My mum would not be able to use Bitcoin. But then if she had been trying to use the internet in the 1990s, she wouldn't be able to use it either. But today she's using her iPad and browsing stuff and using WhatsApp and making video calls. She doesn't know what the technology does. She doesn't know how it's used, but she's using it. And I think we're getting there with, so there's a lot of plumbing that's taking place, infrastructure that's taking place right now.
So just a question to me on what the brother said earlier, from my understanding. Is there any way that Bitcoin could be then pegged to gold, for example? So then we also have because it's mentioned the Quran here about gold.
Yeah. Why would you want to peg? So what you're saying is not Bitcoin. Is there a way you can have a cryptocurrency that's pegged to gold? Bitcoin is Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Its algorithm is set. It's not going to be pegged to anything else now. But I think what you're suggesting is, could you have a cryptocurrency that is pegged to gold? The answer is yes, you could. Yeah. But then where's the gold custodied? Who holds the gold? Remember that when you have a currency that's pegged to something, that something is important. And who controls that something becomes very important. So if I have a crypto that's pegged to gold, then who holds my gold?
The central banks, for example, right?
Yeah.
The thing is, what I'm reading in the paper is that China's, again, the major countries have been buying gold stealth through vice stealth for the last so many years, yeah. Okay, gold prices have gone up and it's gone up like hockey stick for them. But then there is a value in pegging some form of a currency, whether it's Bitcoin. I understand Bitcoin, blockchain and all that, yeah. But I mean, is there any way that you could see, for the people that you spoke to, that you could actually link it to?
So again, I'm going to ask you to separate Bitcoin from everything else. What you have just described to me is a type of cryptocurrency that is pegged to gold. Call it e-gold, if you like. Let's call it e-gold. Now, is e-gold a good thing? Is Bitcoin a good thing? I think potentially both are. My problem with e-gold is that gold itself is highly manipulated, and it's held, 8,000 tons of it is held in the US. So if I one day said, I want to physically see my gold, please, I want to put it in my house, I have to go to somebody who custodies it for me. And they may say no. That's the problem. So it's still manipulated.
So then, could then the other cryptocurrencies be then linked to Bitcoin, for example? In a sense like Bitcoin?
So again, I'm not seeing the point of linking something to something else. Why not just use it?
No, with another cryptocurrency, Ethereum, for example.
Yeah. So the reason why I don't like other cryptocurrencies is because they don't have the characteristics of sound money. They're not deflationary. They can be manipulated. Their value changes. They're not decentralized. They require proof of stake, not proof of work. In other words, the more of it you have, the more influential you are, which is the same as fiat money, by the way. So they don't solve the problems that fiat money have. They just make them worse because it makes it more speedy and efficient.
I'll think about it.
Yeah.
Thank you, man. Thank
Yeah. But that's important to understand what Bitcoin does and what everything else does. So if you drew a Venn diagram, actually there's no overlap. What you have is Bitcoin. You've got fiat money on one side, and within fiat money you've got a sub-circle within the fiat circle that says crypto. And then outside of that circle you've got Bitcoin. It's completely different to the others. It's decentralized, these are not. This is proof of work, these are not. Make sense? Other criticisms we talked about CIA. Mal. So this is apparently one of the students of Sheikh Taqi Usmani is saying it's not mal, it's not property. What a ridiculous statement. What a ridiculous statement. Would somebody buy, if I sold these on the open market for 1 pence, I'd probably get a lot of buyers for it. That represents mal, that's inventory, that's stock, that's wealth. I can create that, I can convert it into money. I can sell any of these goods and convert them into money. I can sell my Bitcoin to somebody and convert it into fiat money. Of course that's wealth. It's a store of wealth. It holds value. It has held value since I've held it. Every 3-year period it goes up in value versus fiat currencies. This idea that in Sharia it's somehow not mal, it's not wealth, is completely illogical. It flies in the face of the facts. So The moment I read this fatwa, and the very first thing they say is, it's not mal, I just think, there's really not much point reading the rest of this. Because it's actually, you know, people refuse to believe what's right in front of their own eyes. Anyway, intangibility we talked about, criminality. People say that Bitcoin is used only for, or largely for criminal activities. Actually, Bitcoin is pseudonymous, meaning that if your coins were stored on an exchange, it's very easy to find out where it comes from. If you used it peer-to-peer, it would be a lot harder. But this idea that Bitcoin is used for criminality actually ignores the fact that a far greater proportion of criminal activity takes place using the US dollar. So why are we even... It's a bit of a straw man argument. I mean, if I want to do criminal activities, I'll use, you know, bricks of US dollar notes. Okay, we're running out of time, and I'm sure you all want to go to Mela in the park as well. Why Bitcoin might save Islamic finance. I'm a big proponent of this idea that, do you remember that article I showed you last week, Bitcoin, Fiat and Islamic finance, and I put up a QR code on that if anyone wants to see it later. But I think Bitcoin is a potential savior for the Islamic finance industry because, as you know, I talked about the Islamic banks being based on fiat currency. Therefore, because fiat is, by definition, is a riba-created currency, this idea that we create these financing contracts and investment contracts on top of a fiat basis means that we're essentially engaging in the same activity that banks, non-Islamic banks, engage in around the world. So I think this idea of combining a type of sound money, whether it's gold, which, by the way, I was always a gold bug before. I still am, by the way. I just think it's manipulated, so it's not the best form of money right now. It used to be, but it isn't anymore. So whether it's gold, whether it's Bitcoin, whether it's something else that we haven't imagined yet, I do think that once we change the monetary base, that Islamic finance has the ability to become something better than it is today. So I think that, you know, as I said before, Islamic economy has been failed by the Islamic banks. There's a trust gap, lack of representation, lack of vision. They don't know what their customers want. They ignore the principles of the Islamic economy, risk sharing, real economy based. Their existence depends on fiat money and the fractional reserve. They reverse engineer the traditional banking industry. They don't have the technical ability anymore. So, you know, the effort right now is being redirected towards these smaller Islamic fintechs. But again, my worry is smaller Islamic fintechs are not addressing the core problem. They're trying to reverse engineer what the banks are doing. And despite all the work the Islamic banking industry has done in the last 60 years, it seems to me that Muslims or non-Muslims have invented what I think might be the most Sharia compliant form of money in existence today, which is Bitcoin. It's by its nature, it's antithetical to fiat-based fractional reserve banking. It's low time preference. It invests for the long term. And we as Muslims invest for our akhirah. We're the ultimate low time preference people. We discipline our nafs during Ramadan, right? We pray and fast. And you would think that we are the ultimate low time preference people who save and invest for our future, not just for our children and our grandchildren, but for our hereafter. That's the ultimate in the low time preference. We believe in disciplining our nafs, our ego during Ramadan. We have this concept of sabr, of patience. It's highly valued in our faith. You know, we encourage free markets. We have hadith about free markets. We believe in condemning and correcting inequality, where all our Islamic finance, prophetic economics, should be about risk sharing in the real economy. We believe in the sanctity of property rights. This is very important. Because if you go and recover your gold from someone who said, I don't want to give you your gold, you don't have property rights. We believe in freedom from state interference. The famous story of Imam Abu Hanifa, who refused the judgeship in Kufa. When the governor said, I want you to be my judge, he said, he refused, and he said, Wallah, I will not be responsible for cutting off a man's head if the ruler decreed that I had to do that. So we believe in the separation of state and judiciary just as much as we should believe in the separation of state and money. The state should not be allowed to manipulate what the people agree is money. So I think that modern fiat money feasts on corruption and manipulation. And I would like to use a form of money that is essentially immune to that corruption. Okay, that's it from me. Next week we take a break. We'll be back the week after, which is the 26th, I think, of July. So Jazakallah khair, thank you very much for coming, and inshallah see you in 2 weeks' time.